And so now, as you know, this is a night that our whole community is observing a Shabbat of unity to celebrate our connection to Israel and to rededicate ourselves to togetherness and oneness as part of the global community of Israel. So I want to open my remarks by sharing with you some impressions I had on one of my trips to Israel a few years ago. I had made the commitment before I left to go visit a place where I'd never been before. So I made the arrangements to go visit this place, which was a small cemetery in Tel Aviv called Nachlat Yitzchak. And it's the place where my grandparents are buried. I'd never met either of them. They had died long before I was born. But of course, as I know isn't the case in your families, just as in mine, the dead still have a strange way of living on, even when they're no longer with us. The stories that I heard in my family about my father's parents were told and retold year after year around holiday tables, at family celebrations. My family finds itself remembering them and recalling them when we reach times of significant transition and accomplishment, when we want to look back to keep track of how far the family has come over the years. So even though they never knew me, in a sense, those grandparents of mine still continue to bless me, even though they're long gone. It's one of the wonderful things about family. So I was eager to make my way to the cemetery to find the graves that I'd thought about and imagined for so long, to see what it would feel like to see my name there on the stones and to be in front of them for the first time. So after all of the difficulties and confusions and wrong turns that always become a part of the best intentions we set for ourselves during international travel, I finally made it to the cemetery. I finally made it to Nachlat Yitzchak. Finally made my way to the cemetery. And when I came in, I experienced a sensation that I never expected would be a part of this pilgrimage of mine. I felt deep disappointment because the place was a mess. There were puddles of mud everywhere. There were random clumps of ugly bushes that I think at one time were meant to produce roses, but now grew unkempt into thorny snarls. And there were more graves than you can possibly imagine, a crazy welter of stones crammed against each other in order to squeeze as many dead as possible into that sacred soil. And there wasn't enough room between the head of one grave and the foot of the next to stand, so it was practically impossible to navigate from one row to the other. The narrow walkways that did exist between the graves were patrolled aggressively by scrawny feral cats who instead of meowing, made these sickening groaning noises every time they looked at you. And so when I finally made my way through and found my grandparents' grave, I looked around to find a stone to put there on the headstones, but I couldn't find any around, so I had to give up, and I found a big clump of mud, and I had to try to pull a little pebble out of this big clump of mud, and so I finally did that and was just about to put this muddy rock on the headstone and take a quiet moment of reflection, and I hear an electric drill start to scream from the corrugated tin shed right behind me. So I was disappointed. So I finished what I was there to do, and I wiped my hands on myself and took a last look around. And then finally, when I was about to leave, I saw this small plaque that had been placed. My grandparents' graves were one right next to the other, and it was placed on the small space in between the graves, and it said in Hebrew, "Hanehavim v'hane'imim b'chayehem u'v'motam lo nifredu." They were loving and faithful in life and cannot now be separated in death. And suddenly, I felt some of the disappointment and some of the resentment that the cemetery experienced hadn't been everything I wanted it to be. I felt some of that start to fade. those words and the image of those two graves side by side reminded me why I was there in the first place. I was there because of love. I was there because of what their love produced, and I was there because love was what I owed them in return. And I realized all of a sudden that what they needed the most from me wasn't to be in a place that was physically beautiful and tranquil. What they needed from me the most was the one thing that I was able to provide, the reassurance of a relationship that won't die. So, if losing them physically wouldn't divide them from each other, surely it wouldn't have to separate them from me. When you live in a relationship with someone, when you live in covenant with someone, it means that you don't turn your back. It means that you don't give up because things are muddy, or because they're inconvenient or uncomfortable, or because they haven't paid adequate attention to what you think you need the most. Because that's what it means to be part of a family. If you want the benefits of being part of a family, the wonderful way that it preserves what we love about the people that we love, then we have to do what we can to contribute to an ongoing and a loving relationship. Despite the mud, despite the thorns, despite the groaning cats. And so tonight, our congregation is taking part in this community-wide event that we've decided to call a Shabbat of Unity. And so synagogues all across town are giving time as part of their Shabbat celebrations and observances this week to reaffirm and to reinforce the connection that all of us have with the Jewish state in Israel. Now, of course, I don't have to tell you that the reason that we thought it was so important for us to have a Shabbat of unity is because, at least in part, the reality is that when it comes to Israel, feeling unified with everybody else is a rare sensation indeed. The studies and the surveys, one after the other, continue to confirm what all of us, or so many of us, have already known to be true from personal experience. That in our Jewish community, as diverse and heterogeneous as it is, when it comes to conversation about Israel, there are still very widespread feelings of being outsiders. Some of us feel inhibited about talking about Israel because we're sure that everyone else in the conversation knows more than we do. Some of us are nervous about talking about Israel because we're certain that everyone else in the conversation loves Israel more than we do. Some of us are nervous about even using certain words in our conversations that have become conversational landmines. Some of us feel like outsiders because we're worried that our cynicism about the possibility of peace in Israel sets us outside of the conversation, or because we're overwhelmed and confused, or because we're happy with our Jewish life just the way it is in America. Our community is home to an unbelievably wide and rich variety of political opinion from all across the political spectrum. Yet at times in conversation about Israel, we're certain that everyone else except us is a lunatic from the far right or a moron from the far left. We've read the surveys and the reports that hundreds of congregational rabbis in America are afraid to talk about how they feel about Israel because they're afraid that they're too far left or too far right. And they're afraid of losing members or afraid of losing donations or afraid of losing their jobs. We know about Jewish leaders on college campuses who grapple every day with the unbelievable difficulty of caring for their students who hold diverse opinions in the face of hostile, looming academic boycotts and divestment campaigns. These issues are really hard, and the pressures are real. I understand it, and I am in it with you. But I promise you that these factors are not nearly as hard, not nearly as devastating as what would be the consequences of being part of a community that does not talk about Israel at all, that doesn't engage with Israel at all, that doesn't worry and pray and wring its hands about Israel every day. That's what we have to do, because to earn the blessing, we have to be willing to invest in a relationship that will not die. If I fail to bring you with me into a meaningful and nurturing and realistic relationship with Israel, then our whole community loses out on the benefits that a lifelong relationship with Israel has to offer. Those benefits are real, they are extraordinary, and they can be life-changing. And so I want to talk to you, at least in part tonight, about why I am a Zionist, about why I remain continually connected to that place across the ocean, despite the craziness and the stress and those awful cats. And some of them are the reasons that I hope to tell you that I hope that you will make a commitment to remain connected there too, as a part of the global Jewish family and as a part of the Emanu Jewish family as well. I'm bound to Israel because I'm convinced that Israel occupies a uniquely privileged position to inspire the world. I think that Israel has a unique ability to serve as a source of high moral and ethical standards in its region and across the globe. I stay connected to it because Israel itself is beautiful and inspiring, but maybe even more because it is an incredibly powerful force that channels and inspires the creative impulses, artists and entrepreneurs, scientists and politicians toward moving and beautiful and powerful expression. I stay devoted to it because every time I go there, and I go there a lot, every time I go, I find something I never saw before. Every time I learn something I never learned before. Every time I gather another small spark to elevate my prayer, my writing, my connectedness to all of you. For me, it is crystal clear that Israel's greatest values remain accessible primarily to those who spend time with it. To raise us up in real and lasting ways, spiritually and aesthetically and ethically and culturally. That's why we use the word aliyah to refer to the process of going to Israel. Aliyah meaning ascent or going up. Because that trip becomes part of the work we do spiritually to raise ourselves up, to elevate our lives to the highest level possible. And so that brings me to the special announcement that we've been teasing for the past couple of weeks, my delighted opportunity to share with you that we have already begun planning for our congregation's next trip to Israel, that we have begun putting plans and scheduling and details in place for a remarkable intergenerational trip to depart from Houston in early June of 2017. So I want you to think about that tonight. I want you to think about what it would mean to you and to your family to mark off that time on your calendar. I want you to think about what it would look like to set aside time to have conversations about your household budgeting, to start thinking about what travel to Israel could mean, what you're willing to let it mean to the Judaism that you share with your parents, to the Judaism you hope to share with your children, and to the Judaism I believe you can share with this congregation. It will be an extraordinary opportunity. Those of us who have had a small hand in putting the details together already, though they're still very much in flux, are already extremely excited about the details and the trip and what it will mean for this community of families. When our prayer book talks about Israel, it calls Israel Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the early flowering of our redemption. And in many ways, we do experience Israel as exactly that, as a political phenomenon of redemption and salvation that arrived just in time from the encroaching horrors of oppression and genocide around the world. But we have to remember that that flowering, that blooming, didn't stop after the founding of the state. The most meaningful part of our people's modern history is the flowering that still goes on today and which will continue to bloom long into the future. Israel's redemption is not the kind that shows up at the end of a fairy tale. Israel struggles daily with very real and very difficult issues of security and resources and diplomacy. She's torn between the values of modern democracy at her heart and the religious tribalism that flows in her water and rests under her ancient soil. She strives mightily to establish justice in her courtrooms and in her parliament, despite the legal and religious battles that are constantly waged there. And now, just as always, she continues to agonize over the frustrating hunt for peace with hostile neighbors and among her own citizens as well. And yet Israel shows us time and again that true redemption really does exist. It proves daily that the hope, hatikva, that emerges from struggle and pain really does exist in the modern world. And in order to witness it firsthand, to experience what that flowering and redemption feels like, all you have to do is buy a ticket. Even for the least pious among us, Israel is a place of miracles. Even for those who insist that they're not religious Jews, the time that we spend there reminds us that our liturgy speaks the truth. Israel is the early flowering of our redemption, and it is up to us to cultivate it wisely so that its blossom will endure and sweeten the rest of the Jewish world. To close, I want to share just a few words written by the great Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai in his poem called The Jews. Here's what he writes. The Jews are not a historical people, and not even an archaeological people. The Jews are a geological people, with rifts and collapses and strata and fiery lava. Their history must be measured on a different scale. Friends, this is a Shabbat of unity, and so it is up to all of us to reach in and reach out, to find there the things that connect us in union with the other members of this congregation, of our Jewish community, and of the Jewish world. Because we know that those of us who are loving and faithful in life, and those things to which we are loving and faithful in life, will not be separated from us ever. So I invite you to continue to think and dream and pray dreams about Israel, to continue to watch the news and read your bulletin so that you can continue to connect yourself through this congregation's connection with Israel. And I hope very deeply and very personally to have the chance to welcome you personally with me to Israel next year. Shabbat Shalom.